Dave Parker. He is the founder of 6 Month Startup. 6 Month Startup occurs in Seattle. It occurs in Kitsap. It occurs in Tacoma. It occurs Kansas City, other places. International yet? Okay. So he's put together that program. He was instrumental in scaling, quite frankly, Startup Week, which is now in God knows how many cities across the world, probably 100 plus. He was at Up Global for many years. And quite frankly, he's a legend in the entrepreneurial ecosystem building movement. Please welcome Dave Parker.
I always remind people when you say you're a legend, it just makes you old. My name is Dave Parker. My mom finished here and retired in Paulsbo. My aunt worked for Peninsula College, so good connections. I grew up in Washougal, Washington. So those of you who know the Southeast, I always tell people it's a great place to be from. So good fun and all that. So if you have the presentation up there, we'll start with that. So thanks for the invite. I'm glad to be here. When we first came up with the topic, I'm like, well, let's talk about what you guys want to talk about and how I can help. Because I spent a lot of time today, my 20% time, if you're familiar with Google, Google has what they call a 20% time. So 20% of your time during your vocation, you get to work on the things that you want to work on. So my 20% time is community building and startup community building. Some people say it's my 60% time. Kind of depends on the season, on whether it's 20 or 60. But I'll give you a little bit on me and a little bit on what startup communities are all about and how you can have an impact on your startup community here in Kitsap. So for me personally, 5-time founder and entrepreneur. I've been very fortunate to be part of, sold 3 of those companies and closed 2. So in the baseball math, that's pretty good. In startup math, it's even actually better. So I've been part of total, 9 transactions. I'll have 2 more transactions that closed here recently, but either as a founder, board member, an advisor, or M&A advisor. So one of the things that I enjoy at this point now is helping startup founders actually find liquidity at the end of that journey. And one of the things that's true about startups in general is there's information asymmetry. So as a venture capital investor, what I would find is founders didn't really know much about how to take investment, and VCs had the upper hand. And in that information asymmetry, the investors actually had a disproportionate opportunity. So today, helping those founders sell is kind of an important opportunity for me as well. So I started a program. I did put up there a seafood company. I was on the board of a company called Bornstein Seafood in Bellingham, Washington for 8 years. And it was kind of fun because it was the one, when I got called to be on the board, somebody said, so the stuff you know for tech, does it work for non-tech? And I'm like, that's a great question. I have no idea. I've never tried it. So I got to be part of that board for about 8 years. It was a 84-year-old seafood company that I got to join. It has transitioned from the 2nd generation to the 3rd generation. And in that process, they were looking for outside board members to help add some guidance to the company and where they were going. And then Startup Weekend and Startup Week, I'll tell you more about both of those. It was probably the greatest season of my life working for a nonprofit where what we did every day was all about how did we change the world, which was super fun. It's not as great as starting something when you get to be a co-founder of it or a founder of it, but still a great opportunity to go impact the world, which was great. All right. So lessons from the trenches was the request. So let me give you a few of those from lessons learned from recent work. And in this case, it's Up Global was a nonprofit that I had a chance to work for. I spent about 3 years there. We sold that company to Techstars in 2015. Anybody familiar with the Startup Weekend? Awesome, thank you, love that. So Startup Weekend, my last full year there, we did 1,265 events worldwide in 120 countries. So we were based in Seattle, so people were like, oh, Startup Weekend, you work at that, it happens once a year, it's like super cute. And I'm like, yeah, we had 74,000 attendees last year. But it's super cute in Seattle. 65% was outside of the U.S., and if you guys know USAID, which is the U.S. government, basically used us as a tool to export entrepreneurship worldwide to places that you may not have heard of, like Moldova and other places worldwide. Including the last full year I was there, we do this big event around Global Entrepreneurship Week, which is in November, and we did 230 events over the course of the weekend before and the weekend after. So we basically burn out our entire volunteer base and facilitator base to do those events. And basically you show up on Friday night and I stand up in front and everybody gets a line and you're like, okay, my name's Dave, here's the idea, you should join my team. And about this many people actually. And then by the Sunday we launch a demo where I've joined your team and because nobody picked up my idea, and we do a demo on Sunday. So we did those events in about 120 countries, so about 450 cities worldwide. So the reason I bring up that last event was we burnt everybody out that season, and yet in December we had about 25 or 30 events, and 17 of them were in Iran, which I obviously never went to, and nobody from our team did. But we had people going and basically exporting our type of entrepreneurship worldwide, which is a great reason to go do it. We sold that company to Techstars, and so today you'll see Techstars doing all of those as community programs worldwide. So one of the things that we did while we were there was we wrote a 5 ingredients white paper sponsored by Google, and we basically said, what is it that makes a startup community work? Because a lot of people were trying the same things, and they're like, we want to be like San Francisco, or we want to be like the Valley, we want to be like Seattle, and the answer is, well, there's some common denominators in what makes those things work. And the first three are really, or the first two, are really starts with talent. Talent's, it's all about the people, and the people that you have here in the room and the people you have in the community. The nice thing for you all is people are moving from King County to Kitsap County because of the affordability index. It was actually cheaper to drive my car over on the ferry both directions than it was to get parking downtown Seattle. So it tells you where we're at from a Seattle economic perspective. I wonder for my kids where they will live. Right, because King County is, frankly, just kind of ridiculous, and people talk about how bad San Francisco is, and I, by no means bad-mouthing it. I think we just have to have an eye on making sure we don't become the thing that we worry about becoming. So first one is talent. You have that here, and Seattle has that in a great way. We've been great at importing talent. Sadly, we don't produce enough of our own talent with our own students here in Washington State. So all of the computer science programs in the statewide, only generate about 1,800 computer science students a year. Currently, there's over 28,000 open computer science jobs in the metro area, including here in King County, which means we have to import people, which is driving up the cost of our real estate for all of those reasons. The second thing is density, and you all have density here in downtown Bremerton. You may not have thought about it for a few years, but one of the things about startups that requires density requires that you be able to have working space that's walking distance to food and transit. So places like what Vibe's doing with co-working spaces and what WeWork's done with co-working, all unicorn issues aside for WeWork, is that you have to have density. And for example, I live in Bellevue, and I met with the Bellevue City Fathers at one point, and they're like, how do we get more startups here? And I'm like, well, you need Class B office space with flexible lease terms, and the answer is in Bellevue, there is 0 of that. So there's not even a low rent Class A space. And for startups, the challenge with density is I need to know, so my first startup, we went from 0 to 140 employees in 4 years, and from 0 revenue to 32 million in revenue in 4 years. And I had a couple of sublets behind me because the minimum lease term was 5 years, and we had moved twice before we had that 140 people. So it's not so much just about the density and location, it's also about flexible working space. And if you don't have density, you don't have flexible working space. And some of that you have here in town. The other 3 things you have to concern yourself about, whoops, it went one too far. The other 3 things are culture. We have that here. We have a culture that takes risk. The further east you get from here, continuing around the world, the more culture does not accept failure or doesn't accept risk. So I spent a great deal of time in Japan working for a Japanese venture capital fund, and they were my first investor in my first startup. You don't see a lot of entrepreneurs in Japan. So there's not a lot of people who take risk. The idea of losing face is a big deal. So the idea of taking risk in culture and having a culture that it's okay to go take risk and actually fail, I would say Seattle's not as great as some other places. In the Valley, if you didn't burn through a ton of dough, you didn't actually fail. Here, if you fail once, you'll still have a chance to succeed, but it's really hard if you fail more than twice to actually get any backing and support to go do it again, though the data says you probably are going to fail more than twice before you have your first success in startup land, sadly. Capital, you all think you have some capital challenges and access to capital. The good news is it's a flight away. It's not actually in Seattle. You have to go to the Valley to get it. There are 6 funds in Seattle that actually lead investment capital and venture capital. The good news is they're all close, but the epicenter of that is in Silicon Valley, and it's just a flight away, though there is opportunity for more angel investment here as well. And the last one is regulation and regulatory environment. And the answer is we're all good, right? Compared to other places that I'm in, there may be things that you would prefer to have changed here or things you don't like, or clearly we have a media fixation these days of Washington, D.C. Don't you miss the old days when nobody really talked about D.C.? I miss those days. So versus the news cycle of every day. So those are the 5 things you need for a startup ecosystem to really flourish. By contrast, I just wanted to give you some of the ones from a local outside city perspective to give you perspective for yourselves. The first one I would tell you is one I just got back from. So this is Lebanon. This is Beirut, Lebanon. I was there last week. It was kind of an exciting time to be in Beirut, actually. For those of you who haven't followed Beirut and what's going on in Lebanon right now, my session started, I was training an accelerator program on Tuesday last week. So I was there Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, due to leave late Thursday night, early Friday morning. And the riots, so this changed from riots to protests to revolution. So the latest is the Lebanon revolution. I will tell you, the Lebanese know how to party and have a revolution at the same time like no other group I've ever seen. So this is on our way back from the event on the left, and this is what was happening 4 blocks from my hotel. So I wrote a blog post about it. There's a link there if you want to read about the whole journey. I wrote it from the business lounge at the Beirut airport. I called my wife first, and I said, I'm going to post this, but I had to call you and tell you what I just went through before you read it, because otherwise you'll freak out. So it did involve a driver. There's 8 lanes of traffic. All lanes were on fire. It was about 1.25 miles for the final walk to get to the airport. People were super nice, by the way. It was just, had you been a government official trying to leave Beirut, that would have been different. But an American who was there to run an accelerator program was like, it was great to have you. The funniest part was the military guys at the end on the big military vehicle said, "Welcome to Beirut. We hope to have you come back soon." Right? So the tongue-in-cheek of the Lebanese was absolutely crazy. So a couple things about the market, though, however, you probably don't know, is it is in the 10 oldest cities in the world. It's about 1.6 million people. One of their challenges is they can't get access to hard currency, and you can't take Lebanese dollars out because they're trying to make sure the currency doesn't float against the market because they have a huge inflationary issue. They have 3 venture capital firms. 2 of them are closing. And yet I had a chance to go meet with an amazing group of founders who were super excited about their product, their opportunity, creating jobs for their market, changing their city, changing their country, and creating jobs. So one thing that I love about what I do when I get to go to cities like that is I get to be with my tribe, right? Because you walk in, regardless of the language they speak or what location you're in, you have people who want to go change the world and change their community. And one thing I love about it is they're just slightly delusional, which is the definition of a founder, by the way. You have to be just slightly delusional, or you'd keep a job for a big company, or you keep a job at a government. So if you didn't do it, you want to take that risk. So 275 companies applied for this accelerator program. There were 17 companies there. We had about 35 founders total, at 2 people per class. The last day I was there to do my last session, 50% of the people live streamed in because they couldn't get in because of the roadblocks. So yeah, there's a will, there's a way. So next city for you, anybody recognize this one? This is Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So if you remember in 2008, Cedar Rapids had a massive flood. 3 people got together at that point and decided that they were going to make Cedar Rapids. Iowa City's the big next door cousin, right? It's kind of like here in Seattle. Cedar Rapids, 3 people got together and decided they were going to make a startup accelerator. They started doing events. There's actually a playbook for this, by the way. They started doing events, and this many years later, now 10 years later, they have a $30 million venture fund and an accelerator, and they've successfully graduated 5 cohorts of their accelerator program. So amazing deal there. They're a flyover city. People look at them and go, yeah, that's super interesting, but they're a flyover city, Dave. There's no access to capital. Actually, there is. Not a super big place, 76,000 people total. So the passing the baton thing at the end is one thing that I thought was great because one of the team members that started is a good friend of mine. He now works for the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City, which is a great organization that really helps entrepreneurship in the U.S., but they don't focus on global. But they had to pass the baton. And part of that is because nobody actually owns startup community. It's a community. So, which also means you have to put up with people you don't really like in your community. Like you have to support everybody whether you like them or not, because it's good for the community that everyone has a chance to have success. So, and there's some people, and I'll tell you, in the Seattle startup community that I don't get along with particularly well, but I'm still going to be a fanboy of what they do because it's good for the community. So the next city example I have for you is the western slope of Colorado. If you're not familiar with the western slope includes Grand Junction and Durango. There's about 600,000 people total in Colorado in that area of western slope. Mark Nagar, who's a good friend of mine who used to run Startup Weekend, he was a CEO, I was a COO and Senior VP of Programs. They raised a $16 million fund actually to service that western slope of Colorado, focused on manufacturing and breweries and not very VC-oriented traditionally investments. Half of that fund is by the state of Colorado, and half of that is matching by other angel investors and venture capital investors who want to contribute and give back to the western slope of Colorado. So the van you saw is because to get from point to point in western Colorado, it's a long frickin' drive. So they actually bought a van, and that's, instead of paying hotels, they actually do that van trip between all those cities. Next on my list for you of cities that you should consider or know a little bit about is beautiful Wenatchee, Washington. Some of you have probably been there. Wenatchee has an amazing thing going on in that they have about 35,000 people in total. They do the Flywheel conference there once a year. They've created a gravitational force around startups, and companies from Seattle as well as other places in the rest of Washington go there to pitch their companies and raise money. They are the Apple capital, small a Apple capital of the world, definitely of the U.S. But there's a city there that people wouldn't think about as a startup community, but they have density, very much like you have here. Right, so Class B space with flexible working space. They have talent, and they've really built an interesting community around Wenatchee. So by contrast, just from a table perspective, there's some bigger cities on the list. Beirut's definitely one of them, but at the same time, Beirut has less access to capital than you all have, and frankly, I didn't notice any tires burning when I came over today, so it was kind of refreshing. So we always tend to look at the things we don't have. I don't know if you've noticed Seattle as well. We have a chip on our shoulder that we're not Silicon Valley, but we don't compare ourselves to Vancouver, British Columbia. So I grew up in Portland. Portland has a chip on its shoulder that's not Seattle, but it doesn't compare itself to other next tier down cities. So we always compare ourselves to the city that started way before us. So if you don't know the history of Silicon Valley, there's some great stories there, but it started in 1971. With a lot of government contracts. So Seattle started its venture capital business a whole lot later. So I was on a panel with a government official a few years ago, and they said, we want to become the next Silicon Valley. And my answer was, that's really stupid. We should stop saying that and actually just become the best Seattle we should be, which is kind of getting the chip off our shoulder about not trying to be something we're not. Didn't go over very well, but that's fine. I'm not known for being politically correct. So it's really about the startups and founders. When you look at where these cities and what's working for the cities and what's working, it really starts with the founders and the startups first. If you think about the net new job growth in America, or the Kauffman data says that basically all of net new job growth is created by firms that are less than 5 years old. So when mergers and acquisition happens, jobs go away, and overall government jobs have gone down. So net new job growth really comes from new firms and the creation of new firms, and from technology-enabled new firms, because even non-tech companies are pretty tech-enabled these days from that perspective. It's also not a hoodie-wearing 20-something. So as much as we glamorize that, the fact is, nothing against you if you have a hoodie in the room, just so you know. I wore a collar today because they said I was going to be on stage, so it's important I have a collar on. The average is 40 years old. There's twice as many 55-year-olds than there are under 35-year-olds starting new companies. There's more women than ever before starting companies, which to me is super exciting. And there's also more investment options than we've ever had. So while generally speaking, entrepreneurs starting companies is down in America, which is a sad statistic, women starting companies, immigrants starting companies, minorities starting companies are all up. So that's good that us middle-aged white dudes have finally ceded the floor to something. By the way, I believe in you all a lot more than I believe in us. So we've messed some things up. We're glad you're taking over. More financing options. If you want to read about the Kauffman Foundation's current initiative that they're putting before Senate and Congress, to really make startups part of our community and make it more focused, I'd encourage you to read the Kauffman Foundation's data report. It's quite good. From the founder perspective, it's really about, let me start off with, but there's two types of startups and there's two phases of startups that you all who don't do startups need to understand. So I think of them as two epochs or two epics, depending on how you want to pronounce it. So the epoch version is, if you think of the world before the Game of Thrones and the world after the Game of Thrones, that's an epic, right? The world before the internet, the world after the internet. So BC, AD, that's an epoch, right? So for startups, the two worlds are the world before product market fit and the world after product market fit. Before product market fit, we're launching and we're trying to get a company that will generate enough revenue that makes it sustaining, and we don't have to raise more revenue, don't have to raise more capital. After product market fit, then we're going to grow and sustain and be a viable company long term. But before product market fit, there's stuff they need to not be focused on. So for example, from a service provider perspective, if they don't have a sustainable business, you can't sell them stuff. They're not going to be a sponsor of things. Once they're a business that's actually growing and sustainable, they'll be a great sponsor. They'll be super helpful for what you might be able to sell them or service them with from a vendor perspective. But there's two categories, and before product market fit, you really don't have a company. And you need to focus on having a company and having a sustainable business before you get to go contribute to the community and become a member of the Chamber of Commerce or be part of those folks right now are working. Some of you are here, and I appreciate that you came. But most of the folks that are pre-product market fit are working on their thing right now. They don't have time to come to an event like this, and probably shouldn't in that case. You can't really sell them much of anything, but after they're sustainable, you can definitely get them as a sponsor for things that you want to get them to sponsor for. I actually did this on a plane on a 14-hour flight coming back. So the Kitsap question, does Kitsap have what it takes to do this? And I think the answer is absolutely. So you look at lifestyle. Lifestyle is both a pull and a push, right? So lifestyle can, the ferry, the quality of life, people come here and to retire. But not everybody comes here to retire. So the people who are here to retire actually aren't in this room, though some of you may be closer to that. Right? It really is the culture and what all you've created becomes both a pull and a push. For people who need to be in big markets for fintech companies, the answer is they're going to be in New York and they're going to be in San Francisco. They're not going to be in Seattle. At the same time, from a quality life perspective, virtual workforce, virtual teams, you can totally run a business from not just here, but somewhere on the Olympic Peninsula. As long as you have a broadband connection, that's all that really matters. So you can pull people as a resource. So one thing about founders is if the founders have vision, they'll be able to recruit people from just about anywhere to come join them. So it's really a vision question, not so much a location question. So again, I think it's very much like us in Seattle going, hey, we want to be the next Silicon Valley. And the answer is, yeah, no, we should just get that chip off our shoulder and move on. So I think the same thing is true for you all here is it's not about Kitsap or people losing brain drain. It's about how do we keep the people here that we really want to keep. So what do you need to do it? You really just need a few people to start. When I think back to the Cedar Rapids example, it was 3 people who got together and said, we really want to change this. Do you have a few people who can start? But I have to warn you, it's a super long-term view. You have to be able to have a 10-year plan. So I'm currently I'm in year 2 of a 10-year plan to leave Seattle better than I found it. So it's a crazy plan because Seattle was doing okay before I got there, but I think it can do better, right? And I don't get to take credit for anything that happened before me. And frankly, after I'm gone, nobody will really give me credit for it anyway, and that's okay too. But the founders, I made a difference in their lives. That will make a difference, and that will help them. And that's the part that I can control, is making an impact on that group of people. So you have to be willing to pass the baton. As I mentioned, being part of the community. Sometimes we get around folks in the community. We're like, that person makes me just completely crazy. But that's okay, because they are part of the community, and that's what we have, right? So it's kind of like being in a weird family, right? You don't get to choose who's in your family. And in the startup community, it's a bit the same way. I don't get to choose who's there. They kind of chose themselves, right? That crazy uncle that shows up at Thanksgiving, that's kind of the way the startup community is. And the roadmap's there. So I think if you want to follow it and you say, hey, we really want to have a long-term view and how do we bring startups here from a jobs perspective, you can definitely do that. So what we don't need, however, well, number one, you don't need permission. So if you're waiting for somebody to knight you or some federal thing to happen or from some law to be provisioned? The answer is you're waiting on the wrong thing. So you don't need permission to do it. You just actually have to go find a few people with you who care about it and say, we're going to go do this. The reason I came over is because a few people who were actually in the process of doing it said, hey, would you come over? And the answer is absolutely. It's the same reason I ended up in Beirut. It's the same reason I ended up in Bahrain. It's the same reason I ended up in Moldova. Because somebody calls and said, hey, would you help us with this? And the answer is, I have to say, I love helping founders. The reason is because in a room this size, the founders would look around and say, I know 80 to 90% of the startups in here are going to fail. And I know it's not me. Right? Which is just, I mean, you're right on the edge. Delusion is right here. Right? I mean, you can look over the edge and see delusion, but you know that it's not you. You're like, bummer for you all, because I know I'm going to be successful. Right? And that's the intersection that's so most interesting, is that everywhere I go, it's the same group of people who have the same dreams and visions of what they want to achieve, and frankly just need somebody to believe in them and help them out. And that's worthwhile to go. Sometimes the flights are long, but most of the time it's worthwhile to go. You don't need to worry about the ferry. Like, I think that's probably a nemesis. A friend of mine who also lives here now, former VC, said, you guys should just kill the ferry and not worry about it anymore. I think that's very much the case. And you don't need to worry about being in Seattle. You just need to be the best Kitsap County you can be, and I think that you have things to offer. So there's a great Bill Gates quote that I've found that has been really true over time, which is we underestimate what we can do in 2 years, or we overestimate what we can do in 2, but we completely underestimate what we can do in 10. So can you have another Avalara here? Absolutely. Can you have bigger companies here? Absolutely. Will they be virtual? Maybe. Do you know what they are today? Probably not. Have you seen them yet? Probably not. There's probably a founder here in this room or who didn't come today who's working on their idea and trying to launch their company and have a goal and a vision of what they want to do, and they just need a little bit of help and encouragement along the way, and maybe help navigate the ecosystem here in Kitsap County and make some connections with folks in Seattle. But don't underestimate what you can do in 10 years, but don't overestimate the 2, because it'll be disappointing and hard. But you really have to get to the 10 to have this really matter and be worthwhile. So what can you do specifically? I want to be as tangible as possible. Working with startups all the time, is there's this idea of vision and where they want to go, and there's the thing that they're at right now, which is the starting point, and it kind of goes up and to the right. And there's so many points they can die in between that I always want them to have them focused on. Don't die, so then we can talk about scaling, right? But you have to focus on and don't die. So if you're an existing business, you can help out. You can be a sponsor within the ecosystem in Seattle. We have some great sponsors. They give back. They provide office space for event venues. They occasionally will sponsor a pizza. I'm not talking about big sponsorships, by the way. I mean, if you throw some pizzas out on the table, people will get pretty excited about it. And frankly, it's one less meal for them to have to worry about for their team. So the answer is they're totally good. So if you're in a community, volunteer, attend, support. You can run check-in at an event, and that's super helpful. So I did an event last night for about 140 founders, and I'm doing my part of the event. Somebody's like, they're buttonholing me and saying, can I talk to you about my startup? And I'm like, in case you haven't noticed, the answer is not now. Like, I'm so super happy to talk with you, but I'm hosting 140 people right now. I'm kind of busy. The thing I love about founders for that is they're so focused on their idea, they can't not talk to you about it. So that's good, but give them a little space and, be entertained by them. So, make it's just kind of cute, right? But don't blow them up, because that happens. Like, we just want to encourage them as they go. If you're government, I think the big thing here is support and listen. I've worked with a lot of government folks over the years, and the answer is typically you're trailing there, not leading, and that's okay, as long as we're not getting in the way of startups happening. There's great things like opportunity zones. I think they're great, but there's still answers that haven't been done for those things yet. Founders, love you. I'm here for you. Let me know how I can help. Angels, if you're thinking about being a startup investor, there's a thing called Seattle Angel Conference that you're welcome to go attend, and I'm happy to make connections for you to go learn how to be an angel investor. Those aren't big commitments. In fact, I would encourage you not to have them be initial big commitments, but think about what you do with a $25,000 check and how it matters. The infrastructure there is really good these days as far as how to do it. But if you're interested in becoming an angel investor, I'm happy to connect you with those folks. And then ultimately somebody needs to lead. I think that's the biggest challenge of the whole process, is you just really have to have somebody who'll step up and say, hey, I want to go help with this. Will you join me? If you're looking to be knighted, you're the wrong person to lead. If you're looking for somebody to tell you you should go lead, you're the wrong person to lead. There's really not a lot of glory in this one. It's just a long trudge. So anybody familiar with the bicycle ride called Ramrod? Guys, so I rode Ramrod last summer. So Ramrod, for those of you who don't know, it's right around Mount Rainier in one day. It's 154 miles and 10,400 of vertical. So being my age, my number one goal was train so I don't die. Number two goal was don't walk. And number three was I'd like to finish in under 11 hours. So I finished in about 10 and a half hours. But I look back on all the training that went into that for that year. So this year, I'll ride about 3,500 miles this year, inside and Peloton classes, outside. So last year I rode 5,100 miles on my bike. So my third year of cycling. Ramrod was able to happen because of 25 spin classes a week during January, February, and March prior. Right. It didn't happen because I showed up, paid my fee, and it's the equivalent of one day of the Tour de France. One. It's crazy, right? There's not a lot of old guys riding the Tour de France as a point of reference. But I bring that up because this is all about planning and preparation and the stuff you're doing when no one else is watching, just like every other great success in your life, right? So I hope you'll be part of that community and we can help from that perspective. That's all part of the journey. So thanks for having me over. I appreciate it.